At 12:43 in the morning, 3 soft knocks landed on the study door on the 3rd floor of the Orsini estate, the kind of knock made by someone who knows she has no right to be standing there. There was one rule in that house everybody knew by heart: no staff on the 3rd floor after 9 at night. In 2 years, Josephine Hartley had never broken a single rule. She was the first to arrive and the last to leave, folded the linens into perfect squares, and apologized even when nothing was her fault. Yet there she stood, still in her gray uniform with the white apron tied behind her back, the brass name pin sitting slightly crooked because she had just worked a double shift. Raphael Orsini opened the door. At 34, he was used to people knocking at midnight to deliver bad news, but never a housemaid, and never this kind of bad news. One hand gripped her phone, the other covered her mouth, as if she could physically hold the grief inside. She looked at him and asked, "Are you still awake?" Even though his lamp was burning, even though everyone in that house knew their boss never slept before 3 in the morning. Then she tried to say more, and could not manage a single word. He did not ask why she had come to his door, when the housekeeper's room was only 10 steps from the kitchen. He simply reached for his car keys. If you believe that the person we turn to in our worst moment matters far more than the person we turn to in our best one, then stay with me until the end of this story. And tell me this: would you dare speak a truth? If that truth could cost you the other person forever? If this story touched something inside you, leave a like so I know you stayed with me all the way to the end. If you think there's someone who needs to hear this story even more than you do, share it with them. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this every week, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Before touching the doorknob, Raphael glanced at the clock on the desk. 12:43. He looked at those numbers for longer than a single breath, then rose to his feet. There were nights in this mansion when he let the phone ring unanswered. Nights when he told Gideon to handle everything without reporting back. But tonight he opened the door, and he opened it because of the numbers on the clock, not because of the knock. Josephine couldn't speak at the threshold. She stepped back half a pace, turned, and headed toward the servants' staircase. The narrow, dark wood stairway connecting the staff quarters to the 3 floors of the main house, where for the past 2 years the two of them had stood and exchanged brief words about changing the curtains, about Mrs. Roz needing another pair of hands in the kitchen on weekends, about rain coming. He followed her. At the top of the stairs, she stopped, one hand gripping the banister, and it was there that the words finally broke free from her throat. "My brother passed out during dinner." She spoke softly, as though she were reporting something about work. "At my aunt's house," she just called. "They took him to Boston Children's Hospital." Raphael didn't ask anything. He waited. Josephine tightened her grip on the phone and stared down at the step beneath her feet. "His heart valve is worse than they thought. The doctor said they can't wait until morning. They have to operate tonight." Her voice broke on the final word, and she immediately drew in a breath and pulled it back into place. Straight, controlled, orderly, just like the way she folded towels. She looked up at him and continued in a voice so calm it hurt to hear. "I'd like permission to miss my shift tomorrow morning. I'll make it up on Sunday. If you need someone to cover for me, Mrs. Roz has Marta's number. She works the Saturday afternoon shift, and I think she'd take it." Raphael looked at her. This woman had just said that her brother was being wheeled into an operating room, and the next thing out of her mouth was a staffing solution. "How are you planning to get there?" he asked. Josephine hesitated slightly. "The last bus left at 11, but the earliest one tomorrow morning leaves at 5:15. I'll take that one. The surgery is tonight." "Yes, then you won't get there until 7 in the morning." She didn't answer. She only looked down at the hand wrapped around the banister, her fingers gone white from gripping it too tightly. And in that moment Raphael understood that she had already calculated everything. She had calculated the bus schedule, calculated what time she'd arrive, calculated who could cover her shift, even calculated how she'd make up the hours on Sunday. She had calculated everything except asking someone to drive her. From the bottom of the staircase came the soft shuffle of slippers. Mrs. Roz stood there in a cardigan over her nightclothes, her silver hair tied back in a hurry. The woman who had lived in this house for 31 years looked at Josephine for exactly 2 seconds and understood everything before anyone had the chance to say a word. "Wyatt, sweetheart?" Josephine nodded. That single nod brought down the careful composure she'd just built around herself. Tears fell onto the stair beneath her, and she quickly swept the back of her hand across her cheek, as if she'd spilled something on the floor and needed to wipe it up at once. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to come up to the 3rd floor. I know I'm not supposed to." "Mrs." Roz climbed 2 steps and took hold of her shoulders. "Hush." Then she turned toward Raphael, and the look she gave him wasn't the look of an employee looking at her employer, But Raphael was no longer there. He was already heading down the stairs, past Mrs. Roz, through the dark hallway, through the side door leading to the garage, and in his hand was the ring of keys he'd been holding since the moment he stood in the doorway of his study. Gideon Marsh was already waiting in the foyer, his coat draped over one arm as if he had known something was wrong from the moment he heard footsteps on the servants' staircase. "Let me call Tomas," he said. "He can be up in 4 minutes. And I'll send 2 cars with you, one in front and one behind." Raphael walked past him without stopping. "No need. Tonight isn't the night to go out alone. You sent those files last week. I know what I sent. Then you also know that ever since last week, every time you've gone through those gates, you've had someone with you." Raphael stopped at the side door, one hand resting on the knob. "Not tonight." Gideon looked at him, then at the woman in the gray uniform standing close to the wall at the far end of the hall, still clutching her phone, and he didn't say another word. He simply stepped back, just enough to clear the way. When the two of them disappeared behind the door, Gideon remained exactly where he was. He had worked for the Orsini family for 22 years, had driven Raphael's father, had ridden in the back seat of Raphael's car through 3 winters, and in the 11 years since that night, not one person in that house had ever seen Raphael Orsini take the wheel himself after dark. Not once. Gideon stood there listening to the engine turn over in the garage, then to the tires rolling over the gravel, and he didn't call anyone. Inside the car, Josephine sat with her back straight, both hands placed neatly in her lap. She hadn't taken off her apron, the bow tied behind her waist pressed against the seat back, forcing her to lean slightly forward, and she stayed that way for the first 10 minutes, without even thinking to remove it. "I'm sorry," she said as the car passed through the gates. "You didn't have to do this." Raphael didn't answer. 3 minutes later, as he turned onto the main road, she spoke again. "I'm sorry I went up to the 3rd floor. I know I'm not allowed. I was going to knock on Mrs. Roz's door, but then She let the sentence fall away, then corrected herself. "It won't happen again." He remained silent. By the 10th minute, when the car passed through the toll plaza, she turned toward him for the 3rd time. "I'm sorry you had to stay awake. I know you have things to do tomorrow. I heard Mrs. Roz say you have an appointment in the morning, and if you want to turn back, you can let me out anywhere there's a station and I'll—" "Miss Hartley." He didn't raise his voice. He had never raised his voice at anyone in that house, and perhaps that was why she went silent at once. "Stop apologizing," he said. "Not tonight." Josephine pressed her lips together. She turned her face forward again, her hands returning neatly to her lap, and she sat that way for a long while. Raphael glanced over. Her shoulders were trembling ever so slightly, the kind of trembling that came from trying to hold up something terribly heavy with muscles that had been tired for a very long time. He reached over and turned the heater up 1 notch. "I'm not cold," she said. "You're afraid." Josephine didn't turn toward him. She stared through the window at the darkness, streaming backward outside, and after a while she answered in a voice so soft the engine nearly swallowed it. "Both." Raphael said nothing more. He only pressed the accelerator a little farther, and for the next 20 minutes, the only sounds inside the car were the wind sliding along the body of the vehicle and the sound of her drawing in one deep, steady breath every 5 minutes, as though she were counting out some private rhythm to keep herself from breaking apart. The red light on the outskirts of Providence forced them to stop. The road was empty, not another car in sight, only that light staying red for what seemed like forever, as though it had forgotten that it was the middle of the night. Josephine stared at it, and suddenly said, so softly it was almost as if she were speaking only to herself, "I had 2 hours off this afternoon." Raphael didn't turn toward her. "Mrs. Roz told me to go. My evening shift started at 6, so I could have gone to my aunt's house, sat with him for a little while, and still made it back in time, but I didn't go. I stayed and cleaned the chandelier in the dining room because you're having guests next week." She fell silent for a moment. "I haven't sat down and had a meal with him in 3 months." He kept his eyes straight ahead. "If I'd gone this afternoon," she said, "I would have been there when he collapsed." The light turned green. Raphael drove on. He let the silence stretch for about 10 seconds. Then he began to speak in the steady, measured voice someone might use to read a list, rather than tell a story. "I had a younger sister, Delia. She was 11 years younger than me." Josephine turned toward him. In the 2 years she'd worked at that mansion, she'd never once heard anyone mention that name, not even Mrs. Roz. When she was 22, she called me one night. I was downstairs in a meeting. My phone was lying face down on the table, and I saw the screen light up. I thought I'd call her back when the meeting was over. He paused. She called at 12:43. Josephine said nothing. She only listened. The meeting ended close to 2 in the morning. I went upstairs, saw the missed call, and thought she was probably asleep by then. I left it until morning. He changed lanes, slowly and precisely. By morning, it was too late. Josephine lifted a hand to her mouth. She didn't ask what had happened, perhaps because she knew she shouldn't, or perhaps because the way he had spoken that final sentence had closed every door leading to that question. I thought about that meeting over and over for years, Raphael continued. It was an ordinary meeting. I didn't do anything wrong that day. I did exactly what an ordinary person would have done on an ordinary evening. He looked straight ahead, but guilt has a talent for that. After everything goes wrong, it turns every ordinary decision into a crime. It takes an afternoon spent cleaning a chandelier and turns it into the reason your brother is lying on an operating table. Josephine sat motionless. You didn't put your brother there by staying at work, he said. That heart valve was damaged before he was even born. It chose tonight, at dinner, to fail. Don't let tonight rewrite your afternoon. She didn't answer. She didn't cry, didn't nod, didn't say thank you. She simply reached across the space between them and placed her hand over the back of his hand where it rested on the gear shift. And she left it there. Her hand was cold, calloused at the base of her index finger, and trembling. Raphael looked down at it for exactly 1 second, then returned his eyes to the road. He didn't pull away. He moved his left hand higher on the steering wheel, and he drove one-handed for the rest of the journey, across the bridge, past the sign that said Boston was 48 miles away, through one dark stretch after another where there was nothing to see. Neither of them spoke another word, but they both knew that what had just happened inside that car wasn't merely a gesture of comfort. It was the first time in 2 years that anyone had touched Raphael Orsini without asking permission first. They arrived at Boston Children's Hospital at 10 minutes to 2. Josephine pulled her hand away from his before the car had fully stopped, opened the door, and from the moment her feet touched the pavement, the woman who had spent an hour and 40 minutes trembling in the car disappeared. She went straight to the admissions desk and clearly gave her brother's name, date of birth, medical record number, and the name of the cardiologist who had been following him since he was 4 years old. They handed her a stack of forms. She filled in every single box, including the ones most patients' families left blank. She asked the nurse what medication he had been given, what dosage, whether it was the same drug he had reacted badly to in April of the previous year, and when the nurse had to check the computer, Josephine waited with both hands resting on the edge of the counter, without showing the slightest impatience. She asked whether he would need blood, and if he did, she had the same blood type. She had donated 3 times before, and her records were at Brigham. She asked which floor the operating room was on, whether there was any window where she could see inside, and when they could expect the first update. After every 2 questions, she slipped in an apology. Sorry for asking so much. Sorry for calling the nurse over 3 times in 5 minutes. Sorry for bothering anyone in the middle of the night. The nurse told her it was all right, and Josephine nodded before asking the next question. Raphael stood about 3 steps behind her and didn't interfere with anything. He only watched. He had seen people respond to terrible news in many different ways over the course of his life. Some screamed, some collapsed, some punched walls. He had never seen anyone turn fear into a list of tasks and move through each line with such careful precision. Just then, a man wearing a hospital jacket walked past with a radio in his hand, stopped in front of Josephine, and looked down at her gray uniform and the white apron still tied around her waist. "Miss," he said, hurried but not unkind. "Have you seen the linen cart that was left at the end of this hallway? The night shift keeps leaving things everywhere." Josephine looked up. She didn't correct him. She didn't say, "I don't work here. I'm family. My brother was just taken into surgery." She only turned her head toward the end of the corridor and answered in the polite voice she always used when guests came to the mansion. "I saw one around the corner to the left, right beside the service elevator." The man thanked her and walked away. Josephine turned back to the admissions desk and finished filling in the final box. Raphael took off his coat, stepped forward, and draped it over her shoulders. He didn't say anything. Her body went rigid for a heartbeat, and she didn't say anything either. She only pulled the 2 sides of the coat closed over her chest and kept writing. The pediatric cardiac surgery waiting room was on the 4th floor. There were 9 chairs, a vending machine, and a wall clock whose second hand sounded louder than it had any reason to. Josephine sat down, placed the paperwork on her lap, then reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a sheet of paper folded into quarters. The paper had gone soft along the creases, the kind of softness that comes from being opened and folded again hundreds of times. She spread it across her knees. Raphael sat 1 chair away and saw it. It was a handwritten chart. The left column held dates, The right column held numbers. Some lines had been crossed out and rewritten in different ink, and some had been crossed out as many as 3 times. At the bottom of the page was a circled number, and beside it was another number, much smaller. Probably the amount of money she had. She read that sheet of paper the way someone might read a prayer, her lips moving faintly, one finger tracing each line. Then she folded it again along the same old creases and slipped it back into her apron pocket. By 3 o'clock, she couldn't sit anymore. She stood up and began to walk. Raphael went with her. The 4th-floor hallway was about 40 paces long, with closed doors at both ends. They walked all the way down and turned back, then did it again. She said nothing, neither did he. On the 13th pass, they heard the operating room door open behind them. Josephine turned around before the door had even finished closing. The woman who stepped out of the operating room was dressed in blue scrubs, her cap still tied behind her head, her mask pulled down beneath her chin, and across her forehead was the deep impression left by something she had been wearing for hours. "Are you Wyatt Hartley's sister?" "Yes." Josephine said only that one word. She didn't apologize. It was the first time that night she had opened her mouth without saying she was sorry. "I'm Priya Raval. I operated on your brother." She didn't draw it out for even another second. "The heart valve has been repaired. The surgery was successful." Josephine stood perfectly still. 3 seconds. Raphael counted 3 seconds. 3 ticks from the clock on the wall. And during those 3 seconds she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. "But I need you to hear the rest," Dr. Raval continued. "That valve had been failing longer than we realized, and his heart has been working far too hard for a long time. We're going to watch him very closely over the next 48 hours. Heart rhythm, blood pressure, signs of infection, his response to the blood thinner. If he gets through those 48 hours without complications, then I'll be able to tell you something more. For now, all I can tell you is that he's out of surgery, and tonight, that is good news." Josephine nodded. She nodded like someone who had just been given a set of instructions at work, exactly the way she always nodded when Mrs. Roz went over the morning duties. Then she opened her mouth to ask a question, and no sound came out. She tried again. Nothing. And then her knees gave way beneath her. Raphael was already moving before he had time to think. He caught her, one arm around her back, the other supporting her beneath the arm, and the full weight of her body fell into him. She didn't faint. She was still conscious, her eyes still open, but her entire body had released at once everything it had been holding tight for 4 hours. She grabbed the front of his shirt in both fists, clinging to the fabric the way someone clings to a rope, and buried her face against his chest. "I thought I'd lost him," she said. Her voice was muffled against the cloth. "The whole way here, I kept thinking that when I arrived, someone would tell me to sit down. I kept thinking I was going to have to sit in some chair somewhere and hear them say those words." Raphael said nothing. He simply stood there and held her. He felt her fingers tighten in the fabric of his shirt, felt her shoulders trembling in short waves, and realized that she was trying to cry quietly, trying to cry in a way that wouldn't disturb anyone, even now. Dr. Raval looked at the two of them for a moment, then quietly walked toward the far end of the hallway. They remained that way longer than was normal, longer than the kind of embrace an employer gives someone who works for him, longer than the kind of embrace two people who barely know each other give one another, long enough for Raphael to know he should let go, and to know that he wasn't going to, long enough for her breathing to slow while his did not. Then she lifted her head. Her face was red, her eyes swollen, a few strands of hair clinging to her cheek, and she looked straight at him from no more than a hand's breadth away. She didn't step back, neither did he. Something that had lain still for 2 years inside that house in Newport had just stirred awake in the middle of that hospital corridor, and they both knew it. Raphael opened his mouth. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he had opened it. "Miss Hartley?" A nurse stood at the recovery room door, one hand holding it open. "You can come in now, but only one person. And please keep your voice down." Josephine released the front of his shirt. She swept the back of her hand across her face, straightened her apron, and followed the nurse inside. Raphael remained alone in the middle of the 4th-floor hallway, the front of his shirt still wrinkled where her hands had been. 40 minutes later, the nurse came back out and said a second person could go in now, but only for 10 minutes. Raphael stood up. He had meant to say it wasn't necessary, that Josephine should stay with her brother. But the nurse was holding the door open, and Josephine was looking out at him, so he went in. The recovery room was dark and cool, lit only by the faint blue glow of several monitors. The boy lying there was much smaller than Raphael had imagined, 8 years old, but he looked 6, his brown hair damp with sweat and stuck to his forehead, a line running from the back of his hand up to the stand beside the bed. A machine beeped steadily and slowly, each beat distinct enough to hear on its own. Josephine sat in the chair on the left side of the bed, both hands resting on the edge of the blanket, not touching the boy, only keeping them close. She looked up when Raphael entered, then lowered her eyes again. Raphael stood at the foot of the bed with both hands in his pockets, not knowing where he was supposed to put himself in that room. He had walked into many rooms in his life, and had always known exactly where he belonged. Not in this one. Then Wyatt opened his eyes. He wasn't fully awake. His eyelids lifted about halfway, fell again, then rose once more. He looked at his sister first, and Josephine immediately leaned down and whispered that she was there. She was right there, and he should go back to sleep. But the boy didn't go back to sleep. He turned his head, very slowly, and looked at the man standing at the foot of the bed. He stared for a long time, long enough that Josephine turned to follow his gaze. He studied Raphael's jaw, the faint scar running down the left side, looking like a child trying to match a face to a name he had heard somewhere before. Then he opened his mouth, and in a tiny, hoarse voice, distorted by the anesthesia that hadn't fully worn off, he asked one question. "Are you the man who eats the burnt cakes?" Then his eyes drifted shut. 3 seconds later, he was asleep again, his lips slightly parted, the machine continuing its slow, steady beeping just as before. There were 3 people in that room, and for a long moment, none of them said a word. Raphael remained where he was, both hands still in his pockets, while 3 things in his mind fell into place all at once. The first was the plate. For 2 years, every evening, a small plate of lemon cake had appeared on the upper right corner of his desk on the 3rd floor, always slightly burnt along one edge. He had asked Mrs. Roz about it once, a long time ago, and she had simply said the kitchen had made extra. He had believed her. He had eaten it for nearly 700 nights, and had never asked again. The second was that Josephine had talked about him. Somewhere outside that house, in some kitchen, with an 8-year-old boy, this woman had mentioned him often enough that he had his own name in her home. Not Mr. Orsini, not the man of the house, the man who eats the burnt cakes. The third was that the boy remembered. Children don't remember things adults mention in passing. They remember the things that are said again and again, or the things spoken in a voice that sounds different from all the others. Josephine looked down at the floor. She fixed her eyes on some point near the foot of the bed and didn't lift them again. Both of her ears had turned red in the pale blue light. Raphael turned toward the heart monitor hanging on the right side and stared at it with intense concentration, as though he had never seen anything more fascinating in his life. He watched the line move across the screen, watched the numbers blinking, and understood none of it. They were both trying to do something that looked natural, and they were both failing. The nurse leaned her head through the doorway and said the 10 minutes were up. Raphael turned to leave. He stopped only when he reached the door, without looking back. 700 cakes, he said. Josephine didn't answer, but when the door closed behind him, she lifted both hands and covered her face. Raphael stayed in Boston for 2 days. He didn't tell anyone why, and no one asked. Mrs. Roz called once every morning to ask about the boy, then hung up. Gideon called 4 times, and Raphael answered only 2 of them. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, Dr. Raval came out of the room and said the words she had promised she would say. 48 hours had passed. No infection, no arrhythmia, blood pressure stable, incision dry. Wyatt was out of danger. Josephine listened to every word, then thanked her 3 times, and this time she didn't apologize once. After the doctor walked away, she dropped into the nearest chair and laughed. It was the first time Raphael had heard her laugh in 48 hours, and it sounded like the laugh of someone who had finally set down a sack they had been carrying on their shoulders long before that night ever came. He let her sit there for a while before speaking. "Miss Hartley," she looked up. "I'll cover every medical bill, the surgery, the follow-up visits, the medication. I've already asked. It only takes 1 phone call." The smile disappeared from her face, but not the way a smile disappears when someone feels insulted. It faded the way it does when a person sees something coming and knows they are about to have to say no. She stood. She pulled the sheet of paper folded into quarters from her apron pocket and held it in her hand without opening it. "Do you know what's written on this?" she said. "It isn't just money. It has every month written down, 8 years worth. Some months I paid $200. Some months I paid 15. Some months I had to cross the number out and write another one because I promised them an amount and then couldn't manage it." She looked down at the paper. "It's ugly, but it's mine. It's also what's dragging you down." "Yes." She lifted her eyes and looked directly at him. "But if you pay it, then from tomorrow on, I'll always be the woman you paid for. Every time I bring coffee up to the 3rd floor, I'll think about it. Every time you look at me, I'll wonder who you're looking at. And one day, if you say something kind to me, I won't know whether you're saying it because you wanted to, or because you spent that money and now you feel responsible for me." She paused. "I don't have much, Mr. Orsini, but I still have the right to stand beside someone as an equal in a story. Please don't take that from me, too." Raphael looked at her for a very long time. Then he nodded. "All right." She thanked him, folded the paper along the same old creases, slipped it back into her apron pocket, and returned to her brother's room. That night, close to 1 a.m, Raphael stood at the far end of the 4th-floor hallway and made a phone call. It lasted less than 2 minutes. He gave the patient's name, date of birth, and medical record number. He said to pay everything, including the old balance at Brigham, and added that no notification letter was to be sent, no family member was to be called, and the name of the person making the payment was not to appear anywhere in the record. Then he hung up, put the phone in his pocket, and went back to the waiting room. He didn't tell her. He didn't tell Mrs. Roz, Gideon, or anyone else. The next morning, they returned to Newport. Wyatt had been transferred to a regular ward and would remain there another 10 days, with Josephine's aunt staying to look after him. On the drive home, the sun rose behind them, and the inside of the car slowly grew warmer. Josephine sat in the passenger seat in silence, and around halfway home she fell asleep, her head resting against the window, her apron still on. Her right hand lay in her lap, and inside that hand was the sheet of paper folded into quarters, still held tightly in her grasp. 3 days after they returned to Newport, Raphael went down the staircase in the west wing to make a phone call. There were 7 landline phones in the mansion, and he used none of them. The stairwell was the only place in the house no one passed through before 9 a.m, and it was where he had stood to make these calls for the past 3 years. "Frost called me at 7, Gideon said. "She needs your official signature before noon on Friday. Not a letter of approval, not a draft. The final document, notarized. 3 days. 3 days. She says everything above her has already been approved. They're only waiting on you." Raphael didn't answer right away. He looked down at the step beneath his feet. 3 years. For 3 years, he had sat in his 3rd-floor study every night and pieced everything together one fragment at a time. Shipping records from the harbor district, expenses without receipts, the names of vessels that docked on nights when no one entered them into the logs, and in the middle of all of it was the name Cormac Halloran. The 62-year-old man had sat at the head of the table at Raphael's father's funeral, had placed a hand on Raphael's shoulder and told him not to worry, that his uncle would take care of everything. It had taken Raphael 7 years to understand that the man who put his hand on his shoulder that day was also the man who had given the order, and it had taken another 4 years to rebuild the whole thing into something a court could read. "The terms are still the same?" he asked. "Still the same. You testify, turn over every file, and afterward you leave the state. Permanently. New name. All contact severed. No coming back. No letters. No calls to anyone here." They were very clear that if you stay in contact with even one person, the entire program becomes meaningless. Gideon paused, and they agreed to the other part. "All 37 people?" "All 37. She said one thing, and I'll repeat it exactly. She said that in all her years doing this work, she has never seen anyone sit down at a negotiating table and bargain only for something that wasn't for himself." Raphael made no comment on that. Compensation for household staff wasn't part of any federal agreement, and he knew it. The government would handle his relocation, his new name, his new place to live, but no one was going to take care of the 37 people in this house. Once his name appeared in court, the Orsini estate would close, and the afternoon kitchen helper, the gardener, the night gatekeeper, the housekeeper who had been there for 31 years, every one of them would walk out through those gates on the same morning with nothing in their hands. He had put that number on the negotiating table, and he hadn't yielded a single dollar. "Friday," he said. "I'll give you my answer before noon on Friday." "You still haven't decided?" "I decided 3 years ago." "Then why didn't you sign last week?" Raphael didn't answer that question. He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and turned around. Josephine was standing on the landing above him, carrying a tray of coffee. He didn't know how long she had been there. For 3 seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she came down, set the tray on the small table in the corner of the landing the way she did every morning, and asked, "What's happening on Friday, sir?" She didn't ask with curiosity. She asked in the voice of someone who had just heard 3 disconnected words and was trying to fit them together into a sentence that made sense, and there was something in her eyes Raphael didn't want to look at directly. He picked up the coffee cup. "It isn't something you need to worry about today." She stood still. Raphael was already prepared for her to ask again, to ask one more question, to say something that would give him a reason to close that door a second time, but she didn't. She only looked at him for another second, then gave a single nod, the short, precise nod of an employee receiving instructions. She drew the tray back toward herself, turned the coffee cup handle outward so it would be easier for him to take, then turned and walked down the stairs. Not a word of protest. And it was that absence of protest that left Raphael standing in the middle of the landing for a very long time, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold without him noticing, listening as the sound of her footsteps grew fainter on the floor below. That night, close to 2 a.m, Raphael went down to the kitchen because there was nothing on his desk. The upper right corner had been empty for 3 nights straight, ever since they came back from the hospital, and he had tried not to notice. Only one light was on in the kitchen. Josephine sat on a high stool at the island, not wearing her uniform, only a sweater and slacks, her hair loose over her shoulders. In front of her was a plate, and on that plate was a lemon cake, burnt along one edge. She heard his footsteps and didn't startle. She only looked up. "You're still awake?" Then she gave a quiet, tired laugh. "That was a stupid question. Everyone in this house knows you never sleep." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "I made this at 11, she said, sliding the plate toward him. "Then I sat here all this time and never brought it upstairs. I haven't brought one up for 3 nights. I kept thinking that now that you know, it would feel strange to bring it up." "Why would it feel strange?" "Because for 2 years, I left it there and then went downstairs. I didn't wait around. I didn't say anything. I just left it there." She looked down at the plate. "Some things can only be done when the other person doesn't know what you're doing for them." Raphael picked up the cake and took a bite from the burnt edge. "Mrs. Roz told me the kitchen had made extra," he said. "She's been lying for you for 2 years. Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then she continued, without looking at him. "My house burned down when I was 19. My parents were inside. Wyatt was only 6 months old then. He had been at my aunt's house since the afternoon before, so he was safe. I was in my 3rd year of nursing school. I had 3 semesters left. I dropped out the following week." She slowly turned the plate in a circle against the stone countertop. "For 8 years, I've done everything. Washed dishes in restaurant kitchens, worked nights at a nursing home, cleaned hotel rooms in Providence, then came here. Every place had one thing in common. People needed me. Every place was short-staffed. Every place had work nobody had done yet, and I took all of it. I took double shifts, weekends, even jobs that weren't mine." She looked up, and her eyes were very calm. The frightening kind of calm that comes when someone is finally saying something they have known for a long time. "Because I'm afraid. If one day I stop being useful, I don't know what I'm still here for." Raphael set the cake down. There was a sentence that had been waiting in his throat since that 4th-floor hospital hallway, since the night she placed her hand over the back of his hand in the car, perhaps much longer than that. It rose now, reached his tongue, and stopped there, because behind it stood 3 days, 1 signature, and a journey with no road back. "You're not here because you're useful," he said. Josephine looked up. She stared at him, and for a moment something opened across her face. Something fragile. Something that hadn't yet had time to take shape. "Then why am I here?" Raphael's phone vibrated against the stone countertop. They both looked down at it. The screen lit up with Gideon's name at 2:17 in the morning, and Raphael knew perfectly well that Gideon didn't call at that hour unless it was about Friday. He didn't pick up the phone. He didn't answer her either. He only looked down at the lemon cake on the plate, at the burnt edge where he had taken a bite, and he stared at it far longer than necessary. The phone vibrated until the call ended, and the screen went dark. Josephine stood, picked up the plate, and carried it to the sink. "It's late, sir," she said with her back to him. "I have an early shift tomorrow." She washed the plate, set it upside down on the rack, dried her hands on the towel hanging beside the sink, then left through the door leading down to the servants' quarters. Raphael remained alone in the kitchen beneath a single light, and in front of him was an empty stone counter. Wednesday morning, a black car pulled up outside the gates of the Orsini estate and left its engine running. It didn't ring the bell, didn't honk, didn't try to come inside. It simply sat there, about 10 feet from the fence, and stayed for 40 minutes. The gatekeeper called the house. Gideon was the one who came out. He walked down from the main entrance, both hands kept outside his coat pockets, and stopped at exactly the distance he considered far enough from the car. The rear window lowered about a hand's breadth. The person inside didn't get out. No one reached a hand outside the vehicle. No one raised their voice. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Then the window slid back up, the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the hill without accelerating once. Gideon walked back toward the house. He didn't go in through the front entrance. He circled around the west wing, took the stairwell up, and knocked on the door of the third-floor study at 10:20 in the morning. "Halloran sent you a message." Raphael set down his pen. "Say it." He said he knows who you're talking to. There was nothing else. No name, no date or time, not a single threat that anyone could carry into a courtroom. Just that one sentence, delivered from inside a car parked outside his gates in broad daylight, and both men in the room understood that it was precisely because the message was so short that it carried so much weight. Raphael stood and walked to the window. From the third floor, he could see the front grounds and the road leading out to the gate. Mr. Delgado was trimming the hedge on the left, something he had been doing there for 19 years. The morning kitchen helper was carrying 2 crates of vegetables from a delivery truck toward the side entrance. Somewhere downstairs, Mrs. Roz was reading out the day's assignments to 3 housekeepers, and one of those 3 was Josephine. 37 people. Raphael had counted that number many times over the past 3 years. Counted it while calculating compensation. Counted it while sitting across from Naomi Frost and refusing to give up a single dollar. But until that morning, the number had remained only a number on paper. Now it was Mr. Delgado standing with pruning shears in his hands, exactly 40 paces from that gate. "That car sat there for 40 minutes, Raphael said. "Yes, he didn't need 40 minutes to deliver a 9-word message. No, he stayed 40 minutes because he wanted me to see him staying there." Gideon didn't answer. He had served 2 generations of men in that house, and he knew exactly when silence was the right answer. "What are you going to do?" he asked after a while. Raphael continued looking down at the grounds. "Do you know why he didn't send that message to my lawyer's office, or to the parking garage in Providence, or the restaurant where I eat lunch? He sent it here, to the gate where Mr. Delgado trims the hedges, where the produce truck comes through every morning, where Mrs. Roz walks past 4 times a day to collect the mail." He turned around. "He wasn't sending a message to me. He was telling me he knows where these people are." Gideon lowered his eyes. 37 people are standing in the line of fire," Raphael said, "and not one of them has done anything wrong. Their only crime is walking through that gate every morning to come work for me." He said it calmly, without raising his voice, exactly the way he said everything. But Gideon saw his hand close into a fist, and then open again once at his side. "If I testify and stay here," Raphael continued, "there'll be a car outside that gate every week. If I testify and then leave, change my name, cut every connection, this house closes, and those 37 people become 37 people who have nothing to do with me anymore. Halloran won't waste his time on people who no longer have anything to do with me." He sat down behind the desk again and picked up his pen. "Friday," he said. "Tell Frost I'll sign." That afternoon, Mrs. Roz sent someone upstairs to tell him to come down to the laundry room. Not a message, not a call over the house phone. She sent someone to fetch him, exactly the way she had done when he was a 12-year-old boy sneaking home early from school. Raphael went downstairs. The laundry room was at the far end of the servants' quarters, half a level below ground, with 4 industrial machines and 1 small window near the ceiling looking out onto the lawn. Mrs. Roz stood at the folding table in the middle of the room. In front of her was a stack of white towels reaching almost to her chest. She didn't look up when he entered. She picked up a towel, gave it a sharp shake, folded it in half again, smoothed the 2 edges flat, then placed it on her right. The second towel, shake, fold, smooth, set down. She had been making that same motion in this room for 31 years. "Sit down," she said. There was no chair. Raphael leaned against the edge of a washing machine. She folded 4 more towels before speaking again. "I've been watching you for 2 years, Mr. Orsini. I've seen everything." Raphael didn't ask what she had seen. She didn't say. She simply shook out another towel, and in the sound of the cloth snapping through the air, they both knew exactly what they were talking about. He thought of the plate of cake that had sat on the corner of his desk for nearly 700 nights and Mrs. Roz's neat little lie about the kitchen having made too much. He thought of the night Josephine had stood at the top of the servants' staircase, and Mrs. Roz had understood everything before anyone had managed to say a word to her. "Your father stood exactly where you're standing," she said, "many times. He came down here whenever he didn't want anyone to see his face." She set down the towel she had just folded and smoothed it once more, even though it was already flat. "He stayed silent his whole life because he thought that was how you protected people. He didn't tell his wife, didn't tell his son, didn't tell anyone. Then he died, and not one person in this house ever got the chance to know how much he loved them." Raphael looked down at the floor. She picked up the next towel. Shake, fold, smooth, set it down. It wasn't until after I buried him that I understood something, she said. All my life, I thought leaving meant carrying a suitcase out the door. She looked up. It was the first time she had looked at him since he entered the room. Silence is another way of leaving, Mr. Orsini. It's just the kind of leaving people can't forgive, because they never know when they were left behind. Then she lowered her eyes and continued folding towels. She didn't say another word. Raphael remained there for another 2 minutes or so, leaning against the washing machine, watching those aging hands shake the cloth, fold it in half again, smooth it flat, place it on the right. He thought of his father lying in a dark wooden coffin, dressed in a black suit, his hands folded one over the other, and of the long line of people who had passed by telling Raphael that his father had been a good man, that his father had taken care of them, but that he had never said a thing. He thought of Cormac Halloran placing a hand on his shoulder that day. He thought of a phone lying face down on a table at 12:43 at night, and a call he had meant to return the following morning. Then he thought of Friday, of the signature that would take him out of this state forever, of the new name, of the condition stating that he could never contact anyone here again, and of a woman who would come to work the following Monday morning, carry coffee up to the 3rd floor, and find the room empty. She wouldn't know what had happened. She would only know that he was no longer there. Mrs. Roz, he said. She didn't look up. Yes, but he didn't continue. He turned and walked back up the stairs, and behind him, the steady sound of cloth continued in that room beneath the ground. Thursday morning, Josephine called the financial office at Boston Children's Hospital during her break. She stood in the corner of the back courtyard, sheltered from the wind beside the storage building, and she had already rehearsed in her mind everything she was going to say. She would ask for a 48-month payment plan instead of 24. She would tell them she could make the payments consistently, that she had been paying consistently for 8 years without missing a single month, that if necessary she would take extra weekend shifts. She gave the patient's name, date of birth, and medical record number. The person on the other end typed for a while, then told her that there was no remaining balance on the account. Could you say that again, please? The account has been paid in full, ma'am. Everything, including the balance transferred over from Brigham. The payment was recorded last week. Who paid it? The system doesn't list the name of the person who made the payment. There's a note saying not to send a notification letter and not to contact the family. Josephine remained standing in that corner of the courtyard for a long time after the call ended. Then she went inside, took off her apron, hung it on its hook, and went up to the 3rd floor. Raphael was sitting behind his desk. She knocked, waited until he told her to come in, then entered and closed the door behind her. She walked to the front of the desk, took the sheet of paper folded into quarters from her pocket, and placed it on the desktop. She set it down very gently, almost without a sound. Raphael looked at the paper. He didn't ask anything. He knew immediately. I said no, she said. Her voice was quieter than usual. Her shoulders were straight, her arms resting at her sides, and she stood there completely still. You needed it. I needed to be asked. She spoke those words slowly, each one separate and distinct. I stood in front of you in that hallway. I told you why. I told you something I haven't told anyone in 8 years, and you nodded. She paused. You nodded, Mr. Orsini. Then you turned around and did exactly the thing I had just asked you not to do. Josephine, do you know what makes it different? If you had paid before I had the chance to say no, then it would have meant you didn't understand. But you paid after I said no, which means you heard me, you understood me, and you still decided that what you wanted mattered more than what I wanted. Raphael stood up. I did it because I didn't want you paying that debt for another 8 years. No. She shook her head once, very slowly. You did it because of Friday. He went still. I don't know what's happening on Friday. You haven't told me, but I know that for the past 3 weeks you've been making calls from the stairwell instead of from your study. I know, Mr. Marsh has been coming and going from this house 3 times more often than usual. I know, Mrs. Roz called you down to the laundry room yesterday, and in the 2 years I've been here, she has never done that before. She looked directly at him. And I know people only pay off someone's entire debt when they're about to stop being here. The air in the room seemed to thicken. You paid it so that when you leave, you won't owe me anything, she said. So you can close that account neatly. So you can walk away from here without having to think about me anymore. Raphael opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Do you know why I knocked on your door that night? She asked. He already had an answer. He had believed it for the past 2 weeks. Because you didn't have a car. Josephine laughed. It was barely a laugh at all. Only a breath escaping through her nose, and it was the most painful sound Raphael had ever heard in that house. Yes, she said, because I didn't have a car. She picked up the folded sheet of paper from the desk, slipped it back into her pocket, and turned to leave. At the door, she stopped for 1 second without looking back. I'm still going to repay you, month by month. I know you don't need it, but I do. Then she left. Raphael remained behind that desk until nearly 4 in the afternoon. He did nothing at all. Then he picked up the phone and called Gideon. Tell Frost to send the preliminary approval letter here today. You said Friday. I'm signing today. He signed at 5:15 that afternoon, 1 day early, and he signed quickly, like a man slamming a door shut so he wouldn't have to look inside for another second. Friday morning, Raphael went up to his study at 7 o'clock, and on the desk was something he had already known would be there. The gray uniform had been folded into a perfect square, every crease as straight as if it had been drawn with a ruler. The white apron lay on top, also folded into a square, slightly smaller, centered with exact precision. Resting above it was the brass name pin, placed in the middle of the apron with the lettering facing upward. Beside the folded clothes was a sheet of paper. He picked it up. A handwritten resignation letter, exactly 4 lines long. She was resigning effective that day. She thanked the owner of the house and the housekeeper for allowing her to work there for the past 2 years. She had returned the guest room keys to Mrs. Rosin had written down the curtain washing schedule, so whoever came after her could follow it easily. She wished peace upon the house, signed at the bottom. There wasn't a single line explaining why, not one word he could hold on to and answer. And on the upper right corner of the desk, where a plate had sat for nearly 700 nights, there was nothing at all. Mrs. Roz stood in the doorway. He had no idea how long she had been there. She left at 6, she said. She cleaned her room before she went, even washed the floor. She told me not to call you. Raphael set the letter down. She rented a place in Boston, near the hospital. The boy gets discharged next week. She wants to stay close to him. Mrs. Roz looked down at the neatly folded clothes on the desk. I gave her an envelope. 3 months' wages. Where did you get it? The Household Reserve Fund. I've managed that fund for 31 years. You approve it once every year, and you've never once asked me what I spend it on, she continued without looking at him. I made it clear to her. I told her the money belonged to this house, not to you. If I'd said otherwise, she wouldn't have taken it. Raphael said nothing. Mrs. Roz stepped into the room, picked up the folded uniform, and carried it away. He had thought he would call Josephine. He had thought he would drive to Boston, or at least tell Gideon to find her address. But that afternoon he sat in that room and did nothing, because inside the right-hand drawer of his desk was a preliminary approval letter bearing his signature, signed at 5:15 the previous afternoon, and because there was only one thought repeating itself over and over in his mind, she had already walked out through these gates. She was no longer part of the Orsini household. That black car would never know her name. He told himself that was the best thing he could do for her, and he believed it all afternoon, and he still believed it after darkness fell, and he still believed it when the clock reached 12:43 at night, and he was sitting alone in the room with that empty corner of the desk. 4 days later, he opened his phone and sent her a message. Only one question about the boy. She answered 2 hours later. He sat up by himself today. Raphael stared at those words for a long time before typing 2 words in return. That's good, she answered 10 minutes later. Yes, and that was all. Nothing more. He sat there holding the phone in his hand, his thumb resting over the keyboard, thinking of a dozen things he could type next. He didn't type any of them. Neither did she. Every message was a bridge built halfway across and then abandoned, with someone standing at each end, looking toward the opposite shore, and neither one taking another step. Inside the house, everything continued as usual. The curtains were still washed on schedule because someone had written the instructions down for the person who came after her. Coffee was still carried up to the 3rd floor at 7 every morning, now by another young woman, and she always set the cup down with the handle facing inward. Raphael never corrected her. He simply turned it around quietly every morning and never said a word to anyone about it. It had been raining since morning on Sunday. Raphael drove to Boston alone, without telling Gideon, without saying a word to anyone in the house. He didn't have the address of the apartment she had rented. He had only one thing to go on: the knowledge that on Sunday afternoons visiting hours in the pediatric ward ended at 4 o'clock, and the knowledge that this woman never took a taxi. He parked 1 block from the hospital and waited beneath the shelter of the bus stop across from the main entrance. She came out at 4:10. She was wearing a thin coat, carrying a canvas bag in one hand, her hair tied low and wet at the ends. She walked toward the stop, saw him, and froze in the middle of the sidewalk for exactly 1 heartbeat before continuing beneath the shelter. She didn't ask what he was doing there. She only set the bag on the bench and looked out at the street. Rain drummed loudly and steadily against the metal roof above them. I've loved you for a very long time, Raphael said. No preamble. not a single sentence before it. He had practiced saying those words over the entire 80-kilometer drive, and when he finally spoke them, it was like a man setting something heavy down on the ground. Josephine went completely still. She didn't turn toward him. Both of her hands tightened around the straps of the canvas bag, and she stood there staring out at the rain for a long time. "You can't say that to me now," she said. "I know. You're leaving. I don't know where you're going because you won't tell me, but I know you're leaving." She turned to face him. Her eyes were red but dry. "My brother gets out of the hospital next week. I just rented a room with 3 months' wages someone gave me out of kindness. I lost my job. I don't know what I'm going to do next month. And now you're standing here in the rain telling me that. I'm telling you because 2 years of silence have already ruined enough. I don't want it to ruin one more week." Josephine looked at him. Then she spoke, her voice very calm, the calm of someone who had decided she was finally going to say everything. "That night, I had Mrs. Roz's number in my phone. I had Marta's number from the afternoon shift. And she has a car. I had the taxi company's number. I'd already called them twice before. I could have knocked on Mrs. Roz's door, 10 steps from the kitchen, and she would have gotten up immediately. She would have taken care of everything for me." She paused. "You asked me why I knocked on your door. Then you answered the question for me. You said it was because I didn't have a car." The rain struck harder against the metal roof. "When my aunt called, she told me the doctor said Wyatt might not make it through the night. I stood in the servants' hallway thinking about the possibility that someone was going to have to say those words to me. And at that moment, there was only one thought in my head. Mr. Orsini. Only one." She looked directly at him. "If I had to hear those words, I didn't want to hear them alone. I wanted you standing beside me when they were said." Raphael couldn't speak. "I climbed 3 flights of stairs to break the only rule in that house," she said. "And I didn't break it because of the car." The sound of an engine came from the end of the street. The bus was still about 200 meters away. "Then why didn't you ask me to stay?" he asked. "You had so many chances. That night in the kitchen, that morning in my study, all you had to do was say one sentence. I know. If you'd asked me, I would have stayed." Josephine closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, there was water on her face, and he couldn't tell whether it was rain. "That's exactly why I didn't ask." The bus pulled to the curb, its doors opening with a sharp mechanical sound. "Because I want to be chosen, Mr. Orsini," she said, "not pitied. If I asked you to stay and you stayed, then one day you'd look at me and think about everything you gave up because of me. I've spent 8 years living in debt to other people. I can't live that way anymore." She picked up the canvas bag. "And if you leave, I'll survive. I've survived things much worse than that." She stepped onto the bus. The doors closed. The bus pulled away, sending a spray of water across the sidewalk, and Raphael remained alone beneath that metal shelter, listening to the rain beat overhead until its taillights disappeared completely around the corner. Tuesday morning, Raphael sat across from Naomi Frost in a room on the 9th floor of the Federal Building. On the table between them lay a thick file, its fold marks still fresh, and on top of it was the final agreement, fully printed and waiting only for his signature and notarization at noon on Friday. She went through every provision slowly: the date he would testify, the procedure for turning over the files, the date he would leave the state, his new name, his new state, the clause forbidding all contact. She finished reading, set the document down, and looked at him. "Mr. Orsini, I've been doing this work for 21 years. Raphael didn't answer. "I've sat across from a lot of people at this table. Some shake, some cry, some bargain over every word, some sign and then throw up in the restroom down the hall." She tapped one finger against the file. "But you, for the past 3 years, every time you've talked about this agreement, you've sounded like a man describing a house he already sold. You can describe it perfectly. You know every room, but you don't live there anymore." Raphael looked down at his hands. Something inside his chest seemed to slip out of place. He thought about a phone lying face down on a table at 12:43 at night, and the perfectly ordinary decision to wait until morning before calling back. He thought about the 11 years that followed. 11 years in which he never drove himself after dark, never opened the door for anyone after 9 o'clock, never allowed a phone to ring more than twice. He thought about the way he had built these 3 years of evidence, night after night in that third-floor room, and the way he had chosen a path with a departure date already written at the end of it. He had called it strategy. He had called everything that for 11 years. Halloran killed his father, and Raphael didn't stay to strike back. He built a case and planned to disappear. 37 people depended on his house for their livelihoods, and he didn't find a way to protect them while remaining there. He bought them compensation and planned to disappear. A woman climbed 3 flights of stairs in the middle of the night to find him, and he paid off all her debt and planned to disappear. Every time he stood before something he couldn't control, he chose the same answer. He left, and he always had a very reasonable name for it. Miss Frost, he said, if I testify publicly, under my real name and with my real face, turn over every file, and dismantle every illegal operation connected to the Orsini family, do you need me to leave this state? Frost set down her pen. Witness protection is meant to keep you alive. I'm asking whether you need me to. No. Legally, no. Your testimony has the same value no matter where you live. But Mr. Orsini, you understand what you're saying, don't you? You walk into court under your real name, and afterward you go home and sleep in the same house whose address everyone knows. Cormac Halloran may be in prison, but he will still have people outside. She looked straight into his eyes. You could lose your life. Raphael was silent for a while. I've spent 11 years living like a man with nothing to lose, he said. Now I do. Naomi Frost looked at him for a long time. Then she pulled the file toward herself, removed the final agreement from its clip, and folded it closed. I'll draft another one, she said. You testify. You turn over the files. You dismantle the operation. You stay. And the compensation for those 37 people will be your responsibility, because my side will no longer have any reason to pay it. I know. You'll lose almost everything you have. I know. At noon on Friday, on the 9th floor of the federal building, a conference room had been reserved for the formal signing. The notary arrived at 11:45. At 12:15, he packed his things and left. Raphael Orsini never came. He didn't call Josephine to tell her. He didn't send a message. Didn't ask Mrs. Roz to pass anything along. Didn't drive to Boston. Because if he told her that day, then for the rest of her life she would have to carry the thought that he had given up everything because of her. And he had promised himself that he would never place another debt on that woman's shoulders again. The trial began at the end of March. Raphael Orsini walked into the courtroom under his real name, with no partition, no screen, no distortion of his voice. He took the witness stand, and his face could be seen from every part of the room. Cormac Halloran sat about 20 feet away from him, wearing a gray suit, his hands resting on the table, and for all 3 days, he never once took his eyes off Raphael. The testimony lasted 3 days. Raphael spoke slowly and evenly, refusing to avoid a single question. He testified about his own actions too. The payments he had authorized, the shipments he had known about and deliberately ignored during the first 4 years after his father died. The opposing attorney asked whether he understood that what he had just admitted was enough to expose him to prosecution as well, and Raphael answered, "Yes, I understand." On the second night of the trial, his car was blocked in the underground garage of the building, where he was temporarily staying. He and Gideon got out of there close to 1 in the morning, and Gideon needed 3 stitches in his elbow. At 7 the next morning, Raphael Orsini arrived at court on time, sat in the same chair, and continued answering from the exact question where he had stopped the previous afternoon. The verdict was handed down in the middle of May. Cormac Halloran was convicted, 62 years old, and with the sentence the court imposed, he would never walk free again. 3 other men in his organization were convicted as well. The Harbor District was transferred to a new management board appointed by the city, and the Orsini name began to dissolve. There was no ceremony, no announcement. It was simply dismantled, piece by piece, over the next 7 months. 3 companies were shut down completely. 2 others were sold off for barely a quarter of their value, because no one wanted to buy anything whose name had just appeared in the newspapers. Accounts were frozen, then seized for repayment. The court ordered him to surrender every dollar of profit that had come from illegal activity over the previous 11 years. And Raphael didn't appeal a single line of the ruling. He sold the house in Providence, sold the property along the bay, sold the 3 cars in the garage, even sold the watch collection his father had left him. By the time it was over, all that remained of an empire whose name had once made people lower their voices was 2 small trucking companies, entirely legitimate, hauling goods for retail stores across the state, and enough money to cover 3 months of wages for the people who stayed. There was one thing he didn't sell. The Orsini mansion remained. He kept it not because he loved that house. He kept it because inside it was a gardener who had worked there for 19 years, a night gatekeeper who had been there for 14, a housekeeper who had been there for 31, and 34 other people who had spent most of their lives knowing only that they walked through those gates every morning to go to work. He had promised Naomi Frost that he would take care of them himself, and he did. He reduced his own salary to nothing for 7 months. He mortgaged the land behind the mansion to keep the payroll going. Not one of those 37 people missed a single month of wages. And even years later, most of them still didn't know how that had been made possible. Someone once asked Gideon what the man of the house had left now. Gideon thought for a moment, then said that Raphael still had his name. The only difference was that now it was the name of a man who had gone into court and testified, not the kind of name that made people lower their voices anymore. Throughout those 7 months, Raphael never once called Josephine Hartley. It was a night near the end of October. Raphael was sitting in his third-floor study with 2 stacks of papers in front of him, one the November payroll, the other the mortgage documents for the land behind the estate. Then came 3 very soft knocks at the door. He looked at the clock on his desk. 12:43. He sat still for exactly 1 breath, then stood and opened the door. Josephine Hartley was standing there. She wasn't wearing a uniform. A dark blue sweater, jeans, low shoes, her hair loose over her shoulders and slightly damp from the night mist. There was no name pin on her chest, no apron tied around her waist, and in her hand was an envelope. She looked at him and asked, "Are you still awake?" "Never went to sleep." She nodded, as though that was exactly the answer she had been waiting to hear. "Mr. Delgado let me in. He told me to come straight upstairs, that no one would stop me." She held out the envelope. "I came because I wanted you to be the first person to know." Raphael took it. He opened it, pulled out the paper inside, and read it beneath the light spilling from the study. It was an acceptance letter from the nursing school addressed to Josephine Hartley, confirming that she had been readmitted for the spring semester to complete the 3 semesters she still had left, specializing in pediatric cardiac nursing. In the lower right corner was a stamped confirmation that the first semester's tuition had been paid in full. "It's been 8 years since then," she said. "I thought they'd make me start all over again. But the dean reviewed my old transcript and said my previous coursework still counts. I only have to finish what's left. The first semester's tuition. I paid it myself." She didn't say it with pride. She only said it to make the fact clear. "I used part of the 3 months' wages, Mrs. Roz gave me for rent. I left the rest untouched. For the past 7 months, I've been working nights at the nursing home on Cambridge Street, 6 nights a week. The rest came from a school loan I'll repay over 4 years." She looked down at the paper in his hand. "No one paid it for me." Raphael folded the paper carefully along its original creases and slipped it back into the envelope. Something rose inside his chest that he couldn't name, something that felt like joy and pain at the same time. "And the boy?" he asked. He walked 30 steps. Someone was supporting him, but they were 30 real steps. "Dr. Raval says by Christmas he'll be walking around the house on his own." She smiled. "He's staying with my aunt tonight." Raphael stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come inside. It's cold out there." Josephine shook her head. It wasn't a hard refusal. She only gave the smallest shake and remained exactly where she was, just outside the threshold, in the same place she had stood nearly 9 months earlier, with a trembling phone in her hand. "No," she said. Raphael stopped. "The last time I stepped through this doorway, it took us 2 years to pretend that the servants' staircase was enough." She spoke very softly. "For 2 years I carried coffee up here, stood exactly 1 desk away from you every day, and the 2 of us talked about curtains. For 2 years, I left cakes on that corner of your desk and went back downstairs. That staircase is very convenient, Mr. Orsini. It lets people feel as though they're seeing each other without either one ever having to say anything." She drew in a breath. "I didn't come up here in the middle of the night just to stand there for another 2 years." Raphael remained in the doorway, one hand still resting on the open door, looking at the woman before him. The woman who had walked out through these gates with 3 months' wages and a younger brother fresh from heart surgery, then returned 7 months later carrying a nursing school acceptance letter she had paid for herself. She wasn't asking him for anything. She had come to speak. She stood at the threshold with both hands resting in front of her, and she began to speak. "When I was 19, after the funeral, some people came to my aunt's house. Neighbors. People who had known my parents. They brought food, sat for a while, and told me that if I ever needed anything, I should call them. Then they went home. 3 months later, no one called anymore." She looked down at the hallway floor. "I don't blame them. Everyone has their own life. But back then I learned something. And I carried that lesson with me for 9 years. The lesson was not to need anyone, because every time you tell someone you need them, you hand them a map. And on that map, you've marked the places inside you that break most easily. You never know whether they'll use that map to avoid those places, or to walk straight into them." Raphael didn't interrupt her. "So I did the thing I knew how to do. I made myself useful. Everywhere I went, I became the one who took the shifts nobody wanted, the one who stayed behind to finish cleaning, the one who remembered everyone else's birthdays. I left cakes on the corner of your desk for 2 years." She lifted her eyes, "And I waited. I waited for the day you would look at that plate and understand. I thought if I stayed useful long enough, If I gave enough, then eventually it would turn into something else. I thought being useful was how someone like me earned the right to be loved. She paused for a moment. For the past 7 months, I've worked the night shift from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and every day I took the first bus home. I had a lot of time to think, and I finally understood something. Her voice was very calm. I don't have to earn it. No one does. The night I knocked on your door, I didn't bring anything with me. No cake, no coffee, nothing I could do for you. I came there empty-handed with a little brother who was about to be taken into surgery. And you opened the door. She looked directly at him. It took me 9 years to understand that I was at my least useful that night, and you still picked up the car keys. Raphael stood completely still. I understand now, Mr. Orsini, she said. I don't have to earn it anymore. There was only one wall lamp burning in the hallway, and its light fell across half of her face. I didn't come here to ask you to save me, she continued. I need you to hear this part clearly. My brother is getting stronger. By December, he'll be walking on his own. I have a job. I can pay my rent. I paid the first semester's tuition myself. And I know that 4 years from now I'll have finished paying off that loan too. I don't need anyone to step in and pay anything for me. I've built my life back up. And I built it with my own hands. She drew in a breath, and this time her hands trembled. But I don't want to build it beside you, while pretending I don't love you. Raphael could hear the blood rushing in his ears. You haven't called me once in 7 months, she said. I read the papers. I know you went to court. I know you stayed. I know this house sold almost everything it had. I sat on the 6 o'clock bus in the morning and read your name on the phone of the person sitting beside me. She stepped forward half a pace, and now the only thing between them was the threshold. I don't know why you did any of it. Maybe it was because of me. Maybe it wasn't. You've never said a word to me about it, and maybe you never will. But I'm not standing here to ask you that. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She left it there, without wiping it away the way she always did. That night, I trusted you enough to give you the worst moment of my life, she said. Tonight, I came here to give you the most beautiful truth I have. Then she called him by his name. I love you, Raphael. I have for a very long time. Raphael stood still for a very long time after she finished speaking. Then he began, and he started from the beginning. That Friday at noon, there was a conference room waiting on the 9th floor of the federal building. The notary arrived at 11:45. The agreement had already been printed, and was only waiting for my signature. If I signed it, I would leave this state at the end of that month under a different name. And there was a clause in the agreement saying I couldn't contact anyone here ever again. She stood there listening without saying a word. I didn't go. Josephine closed her eyes for a heartbeat. I testified under my real name. I turned over every file. I testified about my own actions too. Then I stayed. He paused. But I need you to hear this part clearly. Exactly the way you just asked me to hear you. She looked up. I didn't do it because of you. He said the words slowly. If I had done it because of you, then from today forward, every time we argued, you would have to think about everything I gave up. You've carried debt for 8 years. I'm not putting another one on your shoulders. Then why did you do it? Because Mrs. Roz said something to me in the laundry room, and it took me 7 months to understand all of it, because I spent 11 years walking away from everything I couldn't control. And I called it strategy, because my father stayed silent his entire life and died before anyone had the chance to know how much he loved them. He looked at her. And because you were right that day in my study, I paid your debt so I could leave here with everything neatly settled. I thought about that for 7 months, and I was ashamed of it. I stayed because I didn't want to be that kind of man anymore. What does choosing me look like? She asked. It means asking instead of deciding for you. Josephine looked at him, then asked. Raphael stepped across the threshold and out into the hallway where she was standing. He didn't pull her into the study. He didn't remain inside it either. May I kiss you? Yes. He raised both hands and held her face. From the street behind the mansion came the sound of a garbage truck emptying bins, metal striking metal and echoing through the window at the far end of the hallway. Her nose was freezing when it brushed his cheek. Somewhere in the middle of the kiss, one of them started laughing, and then the other laughed too, because 2 years was an absurdly long time to wait for a sentence that short. Then she kissed him again, and this time, neither of them laughed. Afterward, they didn't go into the study. They walked down the servants' staircase, that narrow staircase of dark wood, and sat on the 4th step from the top, side by side on a stair barely wide enough for both of them. They stayed there until 3 in the morning. She told him about the nights she worked at the nursing home on Cambridge Street, about the 90-year-old woman who was always asking her what time it was. Sweetheart, about the 6 o'clock morning bus and the window seat she always managed to claim. He told her about the night in the parking garage and how Gideon needed 3 stitches. About the morning he sat down in the witness chair, and Halloran stared at him for 3 straight days without looking away. She asked if he had been afraid. He said yes. She asked why he had still sat down in that chair. He said because this time he didn't want to wait until morning. Close to 3 o'clock, she said they should make a few agreements with each other, because the two of them were clearly not very good at saying things out loud, so they made 3 rules. First, neither of them would ever make a major decision about both of their lives, and only tell the other person afterward. Second, neither of them would ever use sacrifice as proof of love, without asking the other person first. Third, and Josephine said this one with complete seriousness, he was never allowed to bake anything himself for the guests of that house. The following March, Wyatt climbed all 14 steps in front of his aunt's house by himself, without anyone helping him, then turned around, went back down, and climbed them again just to prove the first time hadn't been luck. Dr. Raval reviewed his echocardiogram and told Josephine that the boy could play ball in the schoolyard just like any other child, as long as he came back for a checkup every 6 months. In June, Josephine walked into her first semester of school after 9 years away. She sat at the second desk from the front, the oldest person in the class, and the only one who had ever spent 4 straight hours standing outside the doors of a pediatric cardiac operating room. In September, the Orsini estate opened a fund to help cover medical expenses for children with congenital heart disease. The house was mortgaged a second time to provide the initial capital. The 2 legitimate trucking companies sustained it with their annual profits, and Mrs. Roz Keller became executive director at the age of 65. She accepted the position on exactly one condition: that she would still be allowed to go down to the laundry room on Wednesday afternoons. From that day forward, she complained at least once every day about paperwork, about forms, about the people at the tax office who kept making her write the same number in 3 different places. The first case approved was for a 5-year-old girl from Fall River. 1 year after that October night, Josephine began her clinical rotation in the pediatric cardiology department at Boston Children's Hospital, the very department that had saved her brother. On her first morning, she tied on the hospital's white apron, with her name printed over the left side of her chest. A man from housekeeping passed by, greeted her, and asked whether she had seen the linen cart anywhere. She pointed him toward the turn on the left beside the service elevator. That summer, workers came to tear down the wall separating the servants' quarters from the main house. The wall Raphael's father had ordered built in 1986. Now there was nothing between the kitchen and the grand foyer except an open space and an archway. But the narrow servants' staircase of dark wood remained exactly where it had always been. No one suggested removing it, and no one ever said why. On the final night of that summer, Raphael was sitting in his 3rd-floor study when 3 very soft knocks came at the door. He looked at the clock. 12:43. He opened the door, and Josephine was standing there with a plate in her hands. "Are you still awake?" "Never went to sleep." She held out the plate. On it was a lemon cake, burnt along one edge. "You made this?" "This afternoon, while you were at your shift." "Why is it burnt?" "Because you were at your shift." She picked up the cake, took a bite from the burnt edge, then made a face, and he burst out laughing. She stood at the threshold and finished the bite. Then she stepped inside. For 11 years, Raphael Orsini had believed that the best way to protect someone was to keep as much distance from them as possible. He believed silence was a form of kindness, that leaving before someone had the chance to need him was the only way to keep from ruining their life. He had built an entire life around that belief, and it had nearly cost him everything. But the truth didn't come through a contract on the 9th floor of a federal building, nor did it come inside a courtroom. It came at 12:43 in the middle of the night, standing outside his door in a gray uniform and an apron she hadn't even had time to take off, with empty hands and a fear she couldn't hide. Love doesn't mean being free of fear. Love means opening the door anyway. The strongest person isn't the one who needs no one. The strongest person is the one brave enough to knock when they have nothing left in their hands, and the one brave enough to open the door knowing that once they do, they may never be quite the same again. In life, there are distances that can't be measured in meters or kilometers, but only by the number of things we never said to one another. 2 people can live beneath the same roof for 2 years, stand only a desk apart every single day, and still be farther from each other than 2 people living at opposite ends of the country. And the saddest thing isn't losing someone. It's spending an entire lifetime beside them while holding tightly to words you should have spoken long ago. Don't wait until morning. Don't wait for the convenient moment. For the moment when you feel confident enough. For the moment when everything is finally settled. With the people we love, tomorrow has never been a promise we can be certain of. Call that person. Say those words. Open the door. If Josephine and Raphael's story touched something in your heart, please leave a like so we know you stayed with us all the way to the end of this journey. If you think there's someone out there who needs to hear this story even more than you do, please send it to them. And if you'd like to join us each day for more stories filled with kindness like this one, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. How did tonight's story make you feel? Have you ever carried words inside your heart that you still haven't been able to say to someone? And if you could go back, would you say them? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest places in your hearts. To every one of you listening to this video, we wish you abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next story.